Welcome to PM Radio Westminster. In this episode, we are discussing project management research. We are actually looking at questions such as what makes excellent research in project management? What are the hot topics and the new trends in PM research? Are we really doing research that helps solving current problems for both professionals and academics? Do research results find their way back to the industry to solve their contemporary problems? And how do project management students select their research topics? And what makes an excellent project management dissertation? To answer these questions and more, we are delighted today to have with us Daniel Nicholls, Research Manager at the Association for Project Management, APM. We are really glad to have him with us in this episode to answer these questions and to give us some insights around this discussion on PM research. We are also hosting distinction dissertation students who recently submitted excellent dissertations for their MSc degree in project management at the University of Westminster School of Applied Management. But first, we would like to welcome Daniel with us to the studio to start our interview. Hello, Daniel. How are you?
Good morning, Daniel, and hi everyone from PM Radio. So that's such a catchy jingle there. I was just going to start doing a little dance, actually.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Can you please start by introducing yourself briefly to the audience?
Yeah, of course. So hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Nicholls. I'm the research manager for the Association of Project Management, as Daniel says. I look after or head up APM's research program, which comprises of many moving parts, but includes funding, events, publications, and much more.
Wow. So I'll start with a very simple question, Daniel. What are the current trends in PM research? What are people doing research on nowadays?
Yeah, it's a really big question there. I think it's one thing what people are actually doing research on, but what are the kind of hot topics? And there's a slightly two different points. At the moment, one really prevalent area that we're seeing, and it's reflective of society more generally, is around sustainability and kind of moving to net zero. And literally, only today, we've just launched our own research fund, and one of the themes is on that exact topic. Another big topic, which we're also seeing again, which is very much kind of mirroring society, is around project data and analytics, which really is kind of taken off in the past 2 or 3 years, but it's a huge area and a huge opportunity for the profession. Sometimes we see, it's interesting actually, what practitioners list is their kind of wish list, the top 5, and what academics list. Sometimes there's a disparity. So in those two subjects, I would say there's generally agreement. But then you get topics like agile, which in the practice world is always in the top 3. And we compare that to the academic world, it's hardly had any research. So if we look outside of the domain of IT, what you'll see is APM, for example, co-owned the International Journal of Project Management. It's the highest ranked journal in the field. But also if you look at PMJ and other journals too, that there are hardly any articles or journal papers on Agile, which is very puzzling considering it's one of the most talked about topics in practice. So again, it depends who you ask, but I would say for me, those are the kind of big 3 topics. And then behind that, you've also got, other kind of subsidiary issues, which are still big, kind of leadership, project leadership, well-being. And again, also looking at the core elements of project management and how we can bring them into a more up-to-date sense, certainly in terms of the digital arena and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Great. So sustainability, project data analytics, and agile, and you mentioned those, the difference between what academics looks at and what practitioners love to have research on or do research on. Have you noticed, now you've been with APM for a long time, let's say, have you noticed any change, any huge change in these trends over the past years?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I first started at APM, there was a big focus on what we'd see as the kind of core elements of project management, so kind of governance, risk, I remember like our early studies, for example, around things like handover, all the kind of element, all the key components that we would see as good project management, but just looking at how we can do them better, sharing kind of case studies by and large. But more recently, I think there's been a great movement from project management more generally to look at how we can address the kind of grand challenges that we see in society a bit more. I'm not saying that that wasn't done before, but I think there's certainly a kind of greater emphasis within the profession on kind of social value, rather than just in terms of the economy, and improving ROI. So what we're seeing more and more recently over the last, say, 2-3 years, certainly 5 years, more and more emphasis on what can we do as academics, but also in the world of practice, to kind of help society, help the world, particularly in some of these big topics, and how we can start to look at what does this mean for project management.
Yeah. There was a considerable shift in mentality towards what kind of problems we want to address.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I would say that what we've seen over the last 5 years or so is a movement from kind of process and emphasis on process, which project management is the core of, to an element of values, and that's very much what I would say.
Yeah. Well, the project management, as we teach it to students, it has two main perspectives: techniques and tools, which we call the hard element of project management, and people, which is the soft element of project management. So would you say that the current orientation is more towards people, maybe because we're looking at social value, social elements, as opposed to processes and the hard elements?
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the things that we always see, that the strong emphasis from practice increasingly is on elements like leadership, emotional intelligence, building that project team. Increasingly, what we've seen, particularly with the pandemic, is that, you know, projects are more and more about people, and often those people might not be in the same place. So how do you build virtual teams? You know, that requires a very different kind of leadership, and a very different kind of skill set, if you like, to kind of work in these kind of project teams, cross boundaries, which is very different to kind of, you know, historically project management is largely kind of coming from kind of construction and the built environment, where people largely would have been on site, and actually building things. And actually we're seeing that if we look at our largest piece of research we've done over the last few years, the golden thread, that actually the largest number of people working in project management is actually in financial services and professional services. And also they're not building anything. It's very much about people.
Oh, interesting to know. Financial services. Okay. And you mentioned something about project data and analytics being one of the top hot topics in research. Does this relate to artificial intelligence in any way or another? Or is it about big data, artificial intelligence, or is it just some analysis of project data?
No, I mean, so they're all part of this kind of wider topic. So when from an APM side, when we talk about project data analytics, we talk about it from the capture of data, and as you say, utilizing big data and kind of analytics tools. But when you start to go into a bit more detail, you've kind of got what's kind of called descriptive analytics, where basically we're looking at our data, and that's helping us make some decisions based on past data, so we can help aid us in terms of forecasting. But also going increasingly, you've got artificial intelligence and machine learning, which you would describe as more kind of prescriptive analytics, or predictive analytics, if you like, whereby we can start to use these algorithms to actually help make more informed choices. So not just looking at past data, looking at live data, making it kind of real, and increasingly you're seeing, you know, can we use, for example, chatbots? Can we start to use artificial intelligence maybe in terms of project support roles, and doing some of these things that we'd have seen in project managing in controls that would have been done by a small army of personnel? Could that increasingly be done and crunched by AI? I don't think they're quite there at the moment, but certainly, you know, the awareness is out there, and there's a strong emphasis on people to take this up in various corporations. But I think one thing that we just need to bear in mind is that we talk about AI and project data analytics, but you also have to do quite a lot of work to get there. So for example, you know, if you take a major corporation, you might have different departments capturing data in different formats. They might actually capture different data. So you have to standardize that over a number of, it might take a couple of years potentially, and start to mine this data. But once you get to that place, it can be a real rich scene.
It is indeed. It just crossed my mind. Maybe we should just highlight what happened yesterday when Facebook changed their name to Meta. And I don't know, there is this new concept of Metaverse or Meta Universe, where you have people, avatars of people meeting on social media platforms or on the internet. It seems like people are just talking about it because it originated in the gaming industry, but now Facebook is using that same concept. It occurred to my mind yesterday when I was reading the news, would there be any time soon, let's say over the coming 10 or 15 years, where you have avatar of project managers just sitting in a virtual meeting room somewhere and discussing the progress of a project? Do you think something like this would happen?
Yeah, possibly, quite possibly, yes. I mean, there is actually a tool out there called Cube, which is spelled Qube, which is used, I don't know if you're aware of it, called, it's led by Professor Eddie Obeng. And it's a bit like that, where people can come together, they can have these kind of interactions and discussions in a virtual world. So there is already tools out there. And I remember from a past life in my previous organization, we were looking at avatars for health. So what you've got in the health world is that the NHS don't really speak to the kind of GP surgeries. And then at the same time, they don't share the information with the police and other social services, for example. What we were looking at doing is developing avatars that could basically provide information across all of these services, so that, you know, that everyone had that information to hand, and you weren't in a situation where maybe something bad had happened to someone, maybe an accident or something like that, and they didn't have all of their kind of medical history to hand. So I certainly could think that's something which might happen in the next decade.
Yeah. Interesting times. Okay, so going back to you as part of the APM professional body, you do offer research grants and research funds. How do you select funded projects or funded research? Do you go on the basis of the wish list of the industry or academia? What are the criteria?
Yeah, I mean, we fund research in two ways, really. So one of it is that we have an annual research fund, which is open to all stakeholders. So you could be a student, an academic, or a practitioner. And we have annual themes. And what we tend to do is we monitor throughout the year, both from kind of literature, but also working with APM's corporate partners and other professional organizations, where we start to look at what are the kind of big topics and where should we focus in any given year. As I mentioned, we've literally just launched our research fund today. So the kind of two themes that we're looking at is, one is around sustainability, and the other is around kind of data and AI, but its application really in terms of the core project management capabilities that we already have. And then the second stream that we apply in terms of research funding is what we call commissioned research. And these are much larger studies that typically try to kind of answer the big questions in the profession. And in terms of how we kind of come about with these, again, with that, we work with industry partners to look at what is the kind of big topics and issues that they also want to address. But also from an APM side, we also look at our own knowledge, so the competence framework, the body of knowledge that we have, and start to see, is there gaps based on these kind of new topics and trends that we need to address, and how we might do that. In terms of how do we select studies, we have a kind of an outline criteria. So on both the research fund and these kind of larger commission studies, they typically look at the same kind of things. So we look at how well is the individual, the research team, how well do they understand the kind of requirement that we have in terms of what that particular brief or tender is looking to address. We look at how applicable is that research to improve an actual project delivery and practice. So, you know, if we carried out that piece of research, what would be the benefit really to the project profession? We look at the kind of backgrounds that the individual have of conducting similar studies. So do they have any experience they can draw upon of where they've delivered any studies of that type? Also, how are they going to actually use that research to build on existing theory? So their kind of knowledge of what's out there already. So some people might have a great idea, but what they might not appreciate is a lot of that stuff has happened before. So how is their research going to add value to what's already out there? And then finally, we start to look at things like kind of impact into simulation. and what the research findings are. So sometimes people might have a really good research idea, but they're not quite sure about how to kind of bring it into practice, or it's not obvious what the kind of real benefits of that research will be. And those are broadly, I mean, there's some other things we look at around, certainly around kind of risks and costs and so forth, but those are the kind of key elements that we look at when we assess a piece of research.
Okay, so you do actually look at both solving existing industry problems as well as developing new concepts and theories from what you said. But would you say you favor more than the other, favor more practical research that has direct impact, not necessarily short-term, long-term impact as well, over developing existing theories or maybe new theories or concepts?
Yeah, so I mean, APM itself is a professional body that is largely made up of practitioners. So when we developed our research program about 7 years ago now, there was a very strong emphasis on ensuring that research was aiding practical project delivery. Obviously, developing new theories, new concepts, and also testing new trends, obviously important. And sometimes it is possible to do one. So what we might find is that sometimes people might do a small research fund study with an aim of developing a theory or kind of a new concept, and they might grow that potentially into a larger study the following year or a couple of years on or something. And that's quite a good way of road testing something, see if it works, and then scaling it up. And also what you can see in there is there actual interest in industry. So sometimes we might throw out these ideas, and as an academic or researchers, we might think they're great ideas. But actually, when you go out to industry and speak to them, they're like, well, not quite what I was pick. Or maybe you could have done it another way. And you're like, oh, we didn't consider that. So that can really aid them in terms of developing their research going forward.
Thank you for this. I'm going to come back to this point in my last question. But an important question now, there is obviously you are a professional body and there is a focus on research that actually does provide some solutions. Now, do research results find their way back to industry? Do suggested solutions get implemented? And if you can give some examples if these things happen really.
No, I think that's a really, really good question, Daniel. When I first started at APM, I remember meeting with many people maybe that are watching this in terms of kind of academia and kind of practice and kind of government agencies. I remember reading that about 80% of the research that we do in academic terms doesn't reach practice. And there's many reasons for that, as you probably well know. And sometimes that's in terms of the formats and the language we use. So a lot of academic research generally informs journal papers, which unfortunately are hidden behind paywalls. And even if we could kind of open up those, in terms of open access to practitioners, the language is very difficult for practice. So the language of these journal papers are kind of academic papers by academics for academics, really. And a typical journal paper is 12 pages, something like this. And if, as a former practitioner myself, I know you're a former practitioner too, practitioners are very time poor. So they don't really have time to read, a dozen pages or more. They really want to know kind of 2 or 3 sides. What is the research, key findings? How do I apply this really? So sometimes that research gets lost and doesn't get implemented. I think also, even when you develop research, so one of the things we do as a professional body ourselves is to try and help academics reach a practice audience. So we can do this through different methods of kind of dissemination, different methods in terms of putting the research out there. So you might have a report, you might have kind of interactive media like video or podcast. Obviously, you take it out through kind of events, which could be virtual or physical. But sometimes it's also about having the research at the right place at the right time and getting it to the right people. And I just really want to quickly give you a good example of that. We did a couple of years ago, back in 2018, we did a study on project leadership, and that was led by the University of Cranfield with a practitioner. And it was a really good example of co-creation, because you had a number of APM's largest corporates involved in this, such as kind of BA Systems, Shell, Jacobs, and many others. And most of our research fund studies, as I say, are very small, maybe £5,000, something like that. And but we were asked to present this research to all the government heads of profession. And when we did that, as well as myself and the research leads, we also brought along the head of project delivery at Shell. And what they were able to talk about is why they got involved, why this research has benefit to their organization, and how they're going to use it. And from that one very small meeting, this kind of presentation, suddenly this £5,000 piece of research went to being disseminated to 1,500 practitioners. We only had a few hundred copies printed, but they wanted 1,500 copies of the report. The following day, when we come back to our offices, we had large corporates that had never interacted with APM before, want to become members of APM or wanting to know how they could get involved in this research. And 3 years on now, that research is informing a project leadership standard that the APM has developed with IPA and MPA, which is about to launch next month. So it's a really good example of what essentially is a small acorn is grown into something much, much bigger. But I think that's a really good example of getting it to the right people at the right time. And sometimes we research topics which might be a little bit ahead of trend, but when we bring them out, I mean, another good example here is we did a study around well-being. And in 2018, when we first started the research, people didn't talk about well-being like such a big issue like it is now. But when we actually published it back in autumn 2019, it was much more prevalent by that time. And it was well picked up by people in industry. And again, it's a real topical issue now that we see. So.
Brilliant. So would you say that this, as a success factor for research to get implemented, research results, you need some sort of stakeholder engagement? You need to bring these people who are concerned and speak to them in a very simple language to disseminate these research results. So can we say stakeholder engagement could be key part of disseminating this knowledge to the industry in one way or another?
Yeah, of course. I think also it's about thinking about who your audience are. So who are the right people and how are we going to get to those people? And sometimes you might only have one shot at doing that. So again, as I say, it's thinking about how you can do that. And sometimes it sounds mad, but we always talk about this debate about that you have to get things out to people multiple times sometimes for people to see it. Sometimes, as a research manager, I mentioned that we might produce something that would go on social media, has come out in different reports, it's gone out as video, and then I might post it, I might create a blog, and then people are like, oh, I've never read it before. And you're like, really? You've never watched any of the videos? You never read the reports? You haven't got any of the e-shots or newsletters? But then, a few people, because people like to pick up information in different ways. So someone might want to read the whole report. Sometimes people want to see something more visual, like infographic or something like that. Sometimes people might want to read it in a magazine, like, maybe that's a project journal, which is a magazine essentially, very short and snappy type articles. Other times people might want to hear it on the way to work, as I say, for a podcast or YouTube video. So if we can try and think about what are the ways that we can disseminate our research to, and who are we disseminating to, and how are we going to get to them, I think that's really important, as you say, from a stakeholder management perspective.
Yeah, indeed. Daniel, what do you think a kind or some level or sort of collaboration could be created between higher education institutions, let's say the academics, and the industry or professional bodies? Let's say professional bodies because you are part of a professional body. What kind of collaboration can we have to respond to industry needs? Because as you said, you highlighted there is a difference in the wish lists of both parties, and there is a difference in the language of the publications. The academic ones that go into journals use a different language than what my professionals would like to use or to listen to. So what kind of collaboration do you think that we can have ideally?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it's around actually getting people to the same place. So when we as academics present our research, we largely go and present that research to academic conferences, which is largely to other academics, really. And practitioners attend a different kind of event. They attend practitioner conferences. So I think there's probably a need to create a new type of event, whether it's physical or virtual, I'm not entirely sure, but some way of kind of aiding dialogue, which starts to open the kind of research discussion around areas of interest. And there's many ways that you could do that. I mean, you could do this kind of through workshops. One idea I did think about was maybe having some kind of triage. So you kind of get lots of corporations or practitioners in a room and start to throw out ideas and say, these are the kind of topics that we have. And then you almost matchmake them with academics or researchers that are interested in those topics. Because sometimes it's that people just don't know one another. And if they did, you could basically do a really much more powerful study, because you'd have, on one hand, a corporation who might be able to, give them access to a dozen or a couple of dozen project professionals they could interview or whatever it might be, but they just don't know who they are. I think the other thing is to look at sometimes is in terms of, as a professional body, I think there's an emphasis on ourselves providing funding, as I mentioned earlier, and kind of publishing work, but also kind of aiding large-scale kind of research initiatives. So a good example here is we work in partnership with Project X, which is a large funded research initiative by the UKRI. And what we do, whilst we don't directly fund the research of Project X, we do act as a dissemination partner. So we kind of produce blogs, articles, interactive media. We try and encourage people to come to events. So, for example, earlier this week, I hosted our first research webinar for a while, where we're getting someone from the University of Newcastle to talk about their research around integrating SMEs in mega projects. And what was quite interesting about that is the language, and because it's a very short format, we had to present it largely to practitioners, and you could gauge straight away in terms of the questions and the feedback that they gave on social media afterwards about how useful that was to them. And what that did is actually gave the research themselves a group or a kind of contact network, if you like, that they could feed on afterwards. So, if they were developing their research going forwards, here's some people that have already attended the session, they know who they are, they know what their research is about, and they're already interested. And that's a really good start for 10 in terms of as they develop their research going forward.
Oh, brilliant. Good, very good examples. I think it seems to me that this area of how do we disseminate from academic language to practitioner language, or from academic audience to practitioner audience, this in itself could be an area of research, don't you think? Try to find the what's happening really, and what could happen to improve this, to bridge this gap between the two parties.
No, I completely agree. I mean, we did set up a research summary series. So I mentioned that we co-owned the International Journal of Project Management. And one of the things, about 3 years ago now, I set up a program which started to look at how can we take the academic publications and basically refit them for practice. So that's something we've done. I think I've done about 60 of these now. But one of the things I'm increasingly doing is to try and look at, is there other ways we can do that, as I say, through kind of blogs and articles, and also trying to encourage my colleagues at APM to get academics involved in major conferences and events. So often when practitioners put on their kind of large scale conferences, they think about other practitioners who's doing great examples. But I think it's also important to actually get academics in the mix, because sometimes they can offer a more holistic view and actually say, well, yes, in your industry in construction, you're doing X, Y, and Z, but did you know in software or in pharmaceuticals, these organizations are doing like-minded things? And they'd be like, oh, okay, that's quite interesting. I didn't know that. And also the academics might be able to then, as I say, develop it into future research. So that's something I always try and encourage. And so when people hopefully see some of our major conferences at the Power of Projects, they always have a kind of a research component somewhere or some academics present.
Thank you, Daniel, for all these insights into how research works. I think it's very important. These are one of the most important points to get the research back to the audience, to the right audience who will be interested in it. Now, my final question is really about students, because I myself, I'm an academic. I used to be a practitioner. I went into academia and I supervise a number of student projects. And I know that the APM, they've got this annual awards festival that is actually going to be next month in November, on the 15th of November. It's an annual event. And among the awards categories is Project Management Postgraduate Dissertation of the Year. So in your view, what makes good student research now? It's not practitioner, not academic. These are students we're talking about. Who get these kind of awards, maybe, in the eyes of the APM?
Sure. Well, firstly, actually, the postgraduate award is actually now they take part in what we call our Festival of Education and Research. So we've because there's been a huge creation of new academic and research awards, we've created a separate event which is taking place in February of 2022 for anyone watching if you're interested, and that covers everything from undergraduate of the year or apprentice of the year right through to best research paper and includes postgraduate. I think you're right in terms of when you look at student research, there's obviously a difference in terms of the kind of more practitioner research or the academic research, but some of the elements are still important. So some of the things that we look at, for example, is just like you would in any academic research, we start to look at what is their kind of demonstration and understanding of prior knowledge. So are they drawing on a kind of key concepts and frameworks? Do they understand the literature that's out there? I'm sure that yourself and many academics who kind of listen to this always try to give them opportunities and access to some of the things out there. But it's one of the things I'm sure that you kind of talk about a lot is really understanding, once you've picked your topic or your question, the research question is obviously key in any piece of research. So getting the right question, don't go too broad, because sometimes people try and be too ambitious and it's such a big open question, you never be able to answer that. So think about what is the question you're seeking to address. That's my kind of first thing I would always say. Then think about how you might do that. So as I say, thinking about the existing literature that's gone before and thinking about how will your research, even though you might consider it small, how will it add value? Also, what's the relevance to the project profession? So you're going to carry out the study. What do you think it might be able to bring to practitioners? Is there a kind of new knowledge? Is there kind of a new framework or process? What might it be? And what we look at is how do people apply that understanding of knowledge? And then finally, how do they present that? So how do they bring it to life? So sometimes people might have carried out a really robust methodology, for example, in terms of how they've developed their kind of research, and you see a really defined research question, you see the kind of methods and calculations they've used, whether it's interviews or surveys, but how would they bring that to life? So sometimes the really best students make it, as you rightly say, they bring that to life in terms of the language. So they make it very succinct, almost like I suppose you describe it in a practitioner terms, an executive summary, if you like, in terms of highlighting, here are the benefits of the research, this is what we seek to address. Sometimes that could be through really bringing to life the key findings, which could be infographics, could be any way they want to go about that. But those are the kind of key things that we look at, as I say, relevance to practice, the question itself and the methodology, is kind of understanding of knowledge and how this research adds value to existing knowledge, and how people present that.
Oh, thank you. I'm sure our student audience will be glad to hear these things, because we've got a very ambitious cohort this year, and I'm sure this applies to many universities as well. Daniel, that was really very insightful, and thank you for having the time to do this. Any final comments before we?
Yeah, I just really wanted to say thanks very much, Daniel, and University of Westminster and PM Radio for having me today. And just really, if anyone's interested in research at APM, or maybe they've heard some of the things that I've talked about or want to know more, you can contact me via mainly our website, which is www.apm.org.uk/research, or just drop me a line, which is research@apm.org.uk. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have, or share maybe a bit more information about some of the kind of funding or events that we've talked about today. So thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thanks to you, Daniel. Thank you very much.